Next lesson is, I think, a lot of fun and quite interesting at the same time. But before I get into it, I had an email from a student asking about something that I kind of left out of the last one, and that was on our nullable foreign key. Remember, we added the medical trials that a patient might not be involved in, or they could choose from a drop-down list of different trials that they could participate in. They can only be in one trial at a time. So it was a perfect kind of arrangement to play with that sort of nullable foreign key one-to-many relationship. Question from the student was, well, shouldn't we show something on the index page? So I got thinking about that, and I thought I'd share this idea with you before we get into the next lesson. That is that we don't really want to show, we've seen some of the names of the medical trials are very long, and we don't need to include all that information right on the index. Leave a lot of the details to the details view, right? But on the index, we might want to indicate that, yes, they're in a medical trial. So just as we have our other summary properties, I thought we could do something like this. Right? So we have a quick and easy way to determine if the medical trial, because it is a nullable int, right? Being nullable, it inherits this has value property from the nullable class so that it can simply be true or false. Is there a value? If there is, then we'll say yes, they're in a trial, right? Because there is an actual value assigned to the foreign key. Otherwise, no, and we'll just return that as a string. And that makes it quite easy then coming down to the patient index, right? Just to throw in a column for this in trial, this Boolean that will show the words yes or no, right? And that's all there is to that. So if I just control F5, we'll just see it in operation here. Coming to patients. And there we go. So it's just an indication, yes, yes, no. So right now, Wilma's in a trial, but if I edit Wilma, come down here and say, no, she's dropped out. She's no longer in it. I can save that change, and you see right away it just says no. So that's a simple change, but I thought it was an excellent question, so I thought we would deal with that before going further. All right, so our actual topic is related to filtering and sorting. So let me come back to Blackboard for a second. So right down here in the week 4 and 5, okay, filtering and sorting, just want to point out that this demo, step 7, I'll break it into an A and a B just because it's fairly long. But there is a whole section in our textbook tutorial. Very good coverage here of adding sorting, filtering, and paging all together. The only thing I'm going to say is I'm going to show you something, a slight different approach, a twist on what you'll find here in the tutorial. Basically, he does the sorting by making each of the column headings a link, right? And dynamically, then you create a query string parameters basically as part of the link. So when you click on it, you are submitting back with the GET request the information about which column to sort on, right? And then later on, he adds an HTML form where you actually can do filtering, right? So the filtering here, it's got a search box, things like that. And so with this form, you can actually then submit and say, I want to search for this, or set different filtering criteria, right? The only problem with his approach is until you get the final, the paging, okay, sorting, filtering, and paging all tied together, it breaks. In other words, like if you have a sort and you do a filter, then you lose your sort, and vice versa. If you have a filter and you click a column heading to sort, then your filter is gone, right? They don't work nicely together. The filter and the sort clobber each other and they don't harmonize. Not until you actually add the third component, paging. The slight change or twist on this approach I'm going to teach you gets around that problem so that, if you aren't going to go to the degree of actually having paging as well, it's not a problem, right? What you can simply do is have the sorting and filtering and they don't interfere with each other. They coexist quite happily, right? So that's the focus I'm going to follow, and that's what we're going to do. Then don't worry, it's nice and clearly laid out for you in my copy paste file. So if you come back to the lesson here, just follow along and I think you'll find it's pretty easy to understand. All right, so what I'm going to do first of all is add a form, just as he does. I'm going to start with, I'm going to start with filtering. He starts with sorting, but I'm going to start with filtering, right? So if I come to my patient index, now, of course, it's only index views where this would ever be useful because most of our other views focus on one record at a time. It's just the index view that actually deals with a collection of records, right? So here's a simple form, right? Notice the action is just index. In other words, when I click my submit button inside this form, it's just going to post right back to the index action again where it came from. Okay, we're setting method to get for now. I'll show you the difference between having that there or not. Remember, we have to specify that because the default is post for any form. Okay, so it's just a couple of divs. We have the HTML drop-down list here for doctors, and I have a all doctors prompt at the top. We have a text box for a search string. You might say, how come I'm not using the tag helpers, so like with a select and so on? Well, the reason for that is this is the original Razor syntax to include these elements in the page that they've now supplemented with the tag helpers. But this, just like with good old HTML forms, ASP forms, when we're first learning them, they're great for persisting values. They remember the value the last time, and so do these. So since I want to go back and forth between this view, back to the controller, and back to the view, and I wanted to remember the last value that was selected in this drop-down list, then I'm going to go with the older style HTML helper approach. Okay, but we do have a regular input type equals submit, right? And I have a little link here, an action to go back to the index, and that essentially clears, right? Because by just doing a get request for the index action, any other filters and everything else are gone. It's just like a fresh request the first time coming to the index action. Okay, so that's in the form. We'll also need to access the controller, right? So come up here to controllers, get the patient controller. All right. So that's great that I have that, but I do need to then look for some additional parameters. When they click that submit button, it's going to pass values in. It's going to have that. We have a text box called search string, so that will submit a string value. And along with that, we're going to have our drop-down list for the doctor, where we can choose a doctor to filter by, or all doctors. And so if it's all, it will be a null, right? So we'll have a nullable int here as the data type for that. And that gets the values coming in from the actual form, right? Okay, well, that's good. But of course, how are we going to get the data there, the select list for the doctor? Great idea that we did earlier is we created our popular drop-down list, right? So I can just call that method. Okay, it gets me the data for the doctor filter, that drop-down list. All right. Now, what I want to do is I want to, after we define the basics of the query, I want to then say, well, wait a second. Depending on the conditions, I might add a where clause, right? So in order to do this, we do start with all the includes, okay? And I'm just going to put this comment in because it explains things a little bit more clearly. We start with the includes, but we also want to make sure the expression returns an iQueryable of patient. And right now it doesn't. If I hover over here, you see it's a iIncludable queryable, right? And that's not going to quite work because it's apples and oranges and it's not going to give me exactly what I want. Now I can change that around just by using a little bit of the query expression syntax. So from P in, right? And I can leave all the includes the same. That won't hurt, right? And then I can just say select P. And there we go, right? And what difference has that made? Well, basically, if I hover over, you see now it's just an iQueryable of patient objects, right? Yeah, we're including all this stuff, but in the end, it's just a patient. It's just that it has everything else added to it. Okay, so that's important to do that. If I didn't, then I would just get an error message later on saying, hey, you've got apples and oranges. They don't play nice together. But what's really neat then is, remember, we're getting these values from whatever was typed in the text box and whatever doctor was picked out of the drop-down list. Now we can decide, oh, do I also, instead of just returning all the patients, maybe I want to filter, right? And I can add, the neat thing about LINQ this way is I can add as many filters as I want. So I'll test. If Dr. ID has a value, in other words, I selected a doctor out of the drop-down list, then I know I want to filter and only see patients for the doctor. So I just take this iQueryable, okay, this query definition, you might say, right? And I say, okay, I'm going to take its current value and add a .where clause. And the .where is that the doctor ID would match the parameter that came in, all right, from the drop-down list. And that's it. Then I go on, okay? Let's add another. So if that's not good enough, let's also check what else we might filter by. So I'll put an if in here for my search string where I could type letters to look for anywhere inside the first or last name. So here, as long as it's not true, that the string is null or empty. In other words, something has been typed in to my text box called search string, right? Then I'm going to add yet another where clause. Okay, and I can keep on doing this as many times as I need to add more and more filters or where conditions, right, to the query before I actually execute it. So, excuse me, in this case, so if there's something inside search string, then I just can use the contains operator here, that the last name, I'm converting everything to uppercase just to avoid any case issues, contains the search string, or that the first name contains the search string, everything converted to uppercase, right? If it's either in the first or the second or both, okay, then this will return true, and then I will include it, that particular record, in the output, right? So the neat thing is that we can keep on adding these where conditions over and over, but because this is a iQueryable, it's like a definition of a query, and I've mentioned this before, it's not till you hit this, till you go actually to list, that actually is sent to the database, and the database forms the query based on our LINQ expression and actually executes it in the database itself, right? Up until then, we're free to modify it with more where clauses, even order by clauses, as we'll see in a moment. Okay, so that's good. We can actually do our filtering now. So I'll just save these changes. I did a Control F5 earlier, so my page here, I should just be able to just refresh, and it'll get the new version. Right, there we go. So here's my select doctor. So if I pick Gregory House, for example, I can click Filter, and I only see the patients for Gregory House. Okay, and I can test that with different ones. I can go back to all doctors, right? Or of course I could have also, here, let me go back, put somebody on here. I could also just click clear, because clear just goes back and sends a get request for the patient, the index action, right? Which of course is like an initial request for it. And I can search patient names. So if I, the letter F somewhere in the name, okay, well, there's only the two of them that have a left. Now Fred satisfies that in both the first and the last, but that doesn't matter. It's just somewhere, right? Yeah. Who has an R? No. Okay, Fred and Barney both have R's somewhere in their names, and so on. So, and you can combine. Okay. Oh, I messed up here when I was making that change just before. So I'm not showing the doctor. I've got the medical trial showing here. Well, let me just quickly fix that. Silly me. Back in the index. Okay. Yeah, somehow I copied it in both spots by accident. So it's the doctor full name is what I'm after, right? So the item is the patient.doctor.full name. Okay, save that. Let's come back and refresh. And there we go. Okay, now you notice that we didn't get prompted. We did a refresh and our filters all stayed in place, right? That's because you see they're up here. Okay, we defined the action, the method of the form to use a get as opposed to a post. If I had it on the default post, I would have been prompted to say, oh, you have to resubmit your form data, which isn't the end of the world, but there's a good reason to avoid that, right? Okay, there we go. So we can see, all right, I've got to pick something else. If I go back to F, okay, now we see that these are two separate doctors, so I can also filter. Let's just go with Doogie Howser and filter on both criteria, and now we're down to the one patient. It kind of sucks when you have very limited sample data. That's one reason I wanted to make sure we had lots in our job bank case. Okay, but you see the filter is fully functional and working. The only thing is, it's there all the time. And since we have Bootstrap, right? This isn't necessary, but it's fun. Since we have Bootstrap, why not use it? It's a great tool. I've got some links up there to tutorials I'll point out again later for you. But using Bootstrap gives us the ability to make our user interface much richer as well. So I'm just going to replace that form with one using the Bootstrap collapse. You can collapse most anything inside of an HTML page using Bootstrap. So again, above the table, I'm just going to take this form and replace it with basically a similar one, except that I'm not using the same method for laying it out, which was really kind of clunky. And I also have it inside. I have a button here, right? And this div is a collapsible one, right? And notice I'm even getting this parameter here for the class as to whether it should be expanded or collapsed will come from view data. So that gives me the ability to switch in the controller and whether or not what I add to this view data value, this dictionary value by the key filtering, by changing what's in there, I can either have the page come up with it collapsed or expanded. Of course, you can always click the button because this button here is set as a data toggle for collapse, right? And where the data target is the div, I'm collapsing my collapse filter div, right? Right here. Okay. So it's just a way to kind of make it a little bit more interactive. Now, along with that, though, the controller has to decide what value it's going to pass for this, right, in the view data for this key value pair. So coming back to the controller, I need to make a slight change here in order to work with that Bootstrap. It's not a lot, it's just a little bit. What I'm going to do is I'm going to, in addition to having the populate drop-down list up here, I'm going to start off assuming that we aren't filtering. So I'll just an empty string inside that key value pair in the view data is fine, right? So I'm going to say, nope, we're not filtering. So if we're not filtering, why have the filter expanded, right? The issue I want to get around is the fact that when we are filtering, right, it's good to see the filter so you can understand why you'll see certain records. If the filter just disappears every time, if it collapses every time you go to the server and back again, well, then that's not very good because you won't know that there's a filter in place necessarily, right? So what I'm going to do is if any of these decision structures where I decide if I'm going to filter by something, if any of them are true, then I want to make sure that filtering is this keyword show, right? Which inside of a collapsible div means we're going to show that div itself, right? So same as down here, this if checks for another possible filter. So if that one is true, then we're going to do exactly the same thing, right? Set our filtering key value pair to the string show, right? The extra white space is just to make sure I don't clump the words together by accident. And that's the only change I have to make, right? And that's only for that little bit of Bootstrap. So let me run it again. Oh, I was Control F5, I forgot. Oh well, here we are. We're running. So if I come to patients, right, now I have my little button, so I can expand the filter, contract it. By the way, you can change the look of the button, you can change the colors used, all kinds of things can be done with the Bootstrap classes. But the idea is that if I choose a doctor to filter by and apply the filter, as long as I'm filtering by something, then this stays open, right? Because I'm putting that extra value in the view data. Now, if I go back to all doctors and apply the filter, technically there's nothing to filter by anymore. So sure enough, the filter div collapses and I don't see it. And that's the effect that I would want is if I am actually filtering by anything at all, right, then the filter should be visible so I can see that there's a filter applied and what it is. All right, so that's just a little bit of fun with the Bootstrap, but basically it's the same functionality we had even without it. All right, well, we're going to go on and add sorting to filtering, but first of all, we're going to look at filtering by something else. What about this medical history? Ooh, you know, when you think about it, maybe you want to see all the patients that have cancer in their history, right? Well, that's a little tricky because doing that in a LINQ query is just not as straightforward as most things are. So we're going to look and see how that is next.